This video is going to deal with printer communication errors. This will usually show up on the screen as an ADN01 error, or the machine will hang up when it's trying to initialize on SPR, but it means that the mainboard is not able to communicate with the printer. There's a couple things that can kind of commonly cause that. Let's go ahead and open up the top of the machine and I'll show you what to look for first. While it's not necessary to do during normal troubleshooting, we're going to go ahead and hinge the front of the machine forward by removing the two screws on either side of the sliding tray, just for demonstration purposes. Okay, now that we can see better, let me zoom you in. The first thing we're going to do is make sure that the printer has power. Look at the circuit board on the side of the printer and verify that there is some LEDs lit, indicating that it's getting power. The color of the LEDs is not as important, just that the LEDs are lit up. Older printers may have less LEDs, but all printers should have some combination of green and red flashing or solid LEDs, indicating that it's getting power. If you don't see any power going to this board, but there's power going to the other components, meaning that the screen is lit up, the power button is on, the ATM sign is on, then there's something wrong with this board. If the rest of the machine isn't getting power, then obviously that's something else to tackle. But in this case, we're getting power to the board, but we're still not getting communication. The next thing we're going to look at is the cable that provides communication between the printer and the main board. This cable is an RJ45 cable. It's gray, it's labeled SHU, and this is the cable that brings data to the main board. Unplug this cable from its socket, push it back in, and make sure that it clicks in place. It's important to do that, where you remove the cable from the socket and then push it back in till you feel it click. Don't just push a cable forward into the socket, unplug it first. One thing to look out for if it's a new installation, sometimes installers will unplug this cable because it looks like an internet cable, and they'll plug the internet into the back of the printer. Usually it's pretty easy to tell because it's a different type of cable. But the cable that's plugged in here should be gray, and it should be labeled SHU. Let's take a look at the other end of that cable. Looking at the back of the screen here, where the main board is, underneath this section, there are two RJ11 cables plugged into the control board. This is the other end of that printer communication cable. Next to it is the cash dispenser cable, but in this case, we're looking for this. This cable is labeled JP8, and it has a phone connector, which is RJ11. Unplug this cable like we did to the one on the printer control board and plug it back into the socket until you can hear it click like that. The reason why we're doing that is this wiring harness is often tied very tight, and it will pull down over time on these cables and partially unseat them. We found that it's better to remove the cable completely from the socket and push it back in rather than just pushing the cable back up into the socket. This solves a lot of problems with printer communication and also dispenser communication issues. So we've checked the power, we've checked the cabling. Another thing to check is the dip switches on the side of the printer control board. They're located over here by this cable. Generally, these aren't going to change by themselves. However, if you find in your troubleshooting that the person who last used the machine was changing the paper roll, or someone had just recently replaced the printer with another module, it's possible maybe these switches got bumped. The standard setting for an ATM, for most models of ATMs, is going to be switch number 1, which is the bottom switch in this row of 8. Switch number 1 pushed in towards the paper roll. All the other white switches should be facing outwards. The exception to this would be an Onyx W. The Onyx W has a unique printer, and it uses switches number 1 and number 3 pointed towards the paper roll. And if you're using a kiosk, those can be 1 and 7. But for ATMs, it's going to be switch number 1 down or towards this paper roll, and then the rest of them out. Once, if you need to move the switches, after you've moved them and got them correct, push this reset button on the side of the printer to reset it, or you can turn the machine off and then turn it back on. After you've reset it, go ahead and try to initialize it again to make sure to see if that solved the problem. From this out of service screen, go ahead and press the device initialize button down here in the bottom left corner and let the machine try and reconnect. And now it has. So in this video, we've covered some common troubleshooting steps for printer communication errors. We've looked to see how, if the printer is receiving power. We've reseated both ends of the printer communications cable, and we've checked the dip switches to make sure they're in the right position. If after all of this, your printer is still not able to communicate, you're probably going to look at having to replace a part. Most likely the printer is the cause, or something with the printer control board, although it technically can be the cable or it can be the main board as well. But those are less likely to be the actual cause. Another thing I want to mention is that the machine is designed to work without a printer if the printer goes down on its own. Meaning if the machine is in service and all of a sudden the printer stops working, communication error, jam, or something else, or runs out of paper, the machine will continue to operate and alert customers that they won't be able to receive a receipt. When in the instance of a communication error though, if someone was to reboot the ATM with that communication error, it's going to go out of service and it's not going to go back in service until you can solve the communication error issue. If the machine's out of paper, you can still reboot the machine and it'll come back up and continue working. But to get it to initialize and go in service, you need to have a working printer in there in order for it to pass the initialization test. Well, I hope this helps, and we'll see you in the next video.